Hi, this is Kozlowski, and in this video we're going to review for the APUSH exam. Review is not meant to be exhaustive, but highlight some of the main themes. So let's go right into this. Period 1 is all about Native Americans and European contact, and keep in mind the very important role of maize, allowing for these formerly nomadic tribes to now become permanent, and they are now able to adapt around their surroundings. Now they're going to have contact, of course, with the Spaniards, and that's going to create a new caste system of new populations. You're going to see the rise of the slave trade, especially after the encomienda system is condemned by Las Casas and the African slave trade begins. But keep in mind there is some social mobility with Native Americans and African slaves as well, as you see here. But it's very important to note that natives are able to attempt to adapt to Europeans while trying to preserve their own autonomy and independence, although that is very short-lived. Also keep in mind that we have three worlds sort of colliding between Europe, Africa, and North America. So that's the big idea. So let's go back into period 2 and very much keep in mind the differences in terms of colonization, the English being perhaps the most ruthless when it comes to looking at contact with Native Americans. Spanish is still a little harsh, French and Dutch having the best in terms of friendlier relationships with Native Americans. Much more diversity in the northern and middle colonies. Note that the southern is most agricultural. They have the greatest use of slaves there, but we are going to see the seeds of self-government begin to emerge. Keep in mind the very important concept of salutary neglect, but the colonies are able to govern themselves. That's going to help these seeds grow much more. Keep in mind the House of Burgesses, town meetings, Mayflower Compact, Great Awakening, and even mercantilism. They're okay with that following the Navigation Acts, but following the French and Indian War, we will know that that will begin to change. And where we see the first hint of some issues in the New World will be the labor in Jamestown with Native Americans being used as essentially slaves following indentured servants and then dealing permanently with the African slave trade. We also have a good amount of religion in the colonies, especially middle colonies. Think Lord Baltimore, John Winthrop in the north, and then of course William Penn in Pennsylvania. Now, the turning point is going to be in period 3 with the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War, and there is this desire for expansion, hence think about the Northwest Ordinance that will come later on. And after the war, the colonists are blamed by the British and vice versa for fighting poorly, even though their side wins. But we're going to see salutary neglect go to the wayside, mercantilism in, so you see the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Act, and it's going to be a lot of different acts of resistance, from Thomas Paine's Common Sense, be very familiar with that, to increasing resistance with the First and Second Continental Congress organizing, and boycotts being perhaps the best method of boycotting the sales of goods that are going to be taxed. We also have the Committee's Correspondence, that was communication amongst the colonies. You don't need to know the ins and outs of each and every battle, but be aware of some of the big ones: Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. And ultimately, following that win, we will establish a new constitution, which will be the Articles of Confederation, which is too weak, and that's going to be exposed by the Shays Rebellion, in which that's going to prompt a new constitutional convention, and that will devise the constitution that we still have today. Washington will be our first president. Keep in mind his Washington's farewell address, very, very important to know. There's a lot of good warnings about sectionalism against political parties. Be aware of that. That can really help you, particularly on the APUSH exam. Now, when we look at the first factions that are going to come about, political parties, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, weaker government, tend to be in the South, agrarian, versus in the North, favoring the national bank. But we begin to see sectionalism begin to emerge under Adams. We also have the XYZ affair that almost brings the United States and France into war. And then we're also going to have the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what's important there is you're going to see the first acts of nullification thanks to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, sort of an omen of things to come. So in period 4, we have this new nation, and we have a number of SCOTUS cases here. And it's important to know this because it's going to increase the strength of the national government over the states. Now, Jefferson as a president has many idealistic goals here. They're not fulfilled. He does, of course, have the Louisiana Purchase. That's huge here, but also perhaps the setback being the Embargo Act, in which the United States is trying to stay out of Britain and France's dispute, and that's going to really leave a stain on his presidency. In come Madison in the War of 1812. This is going to be big in terms of reaffirming American independence. This will also usher in the era of good feelings, which will be relatively short-lived thanks to the Panic of 1819. And we have our first foreign policy here, Monroe Doctrine, trying to keep Europe out of North and South America. We also have the rise of slavery and sectionalism, so keep in mind some of the ways in which they're trying to deal with that. For example, the Compromise of 1820. We're also going to see the Virginia debate and even Turner's Rebellion. The biggest way in which the North and the South are going to try to reconcile these differences is through the American system, and that's Henry Clay's sort of baby there with mixed success here. Now, in come Andrew Jackson following the corrupt bargain, which will allow John Quincy Adams to be the president, but once you have 1 million plus more men being able to vote thanks to property requirements being put to the wayside, you're now going to have him being elected in 1828. He hates the National Bank, hates the Tariff of Abominations, even threatens to kill his own South Carolina vice president. But that's just some of the big things here. But a lot of animosity rising against him, and that will be thanks to the Whig Party. And this is big because this is going to entrench the two-party system. During this time as well, we have Transcendentalism, very uniquely American, the Hudson River School. We also have the women's rights movement being born out of the Seneca Falls Convention. Definitely be aware of that. Period 5, looking at manifest destiny, the desire to expand out west. These are some fantastic examples. Be very familiar, especially with the Mexican-American War. But we also have some debate about these new countries being taken in, with the Free Soil Party being anti-slavery, and that will eventually become part of the Republican Party platform in the coming decades. But slavery is front and center. We have many attempts to deal with this, from Dred Scott, Compromise of 1850, even the Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is all going to inflame both sides. Be aware of that. And Lincoln being elected is going to be the short-term cause that causes the Civil War. Be aware of some of these major aspects here. You don't need to know the ins and outs of every single battle plan here, but sort of the Antietam as well as Gettysburg in terms of being very important battles that are going to be the turning points in the war. Emancipation Proclamation, of course, being perhaps the most important document from that time period. And then, of course, total war is going to end this. But the hard part here is going to be Reconstruction. You're going to have various ways in which they try to deal with this, but radical Republicans are going to take away Johnson's ability to control the South. They are going to be imposing drastic measures, and we're going to see the 13th through 15th Amendments being passed, as well as the Freedmen's Bureau. But there are drawbacks from sharecropping, the tenant farming, and the election of 1876 is going to end Reconstruction. So it has a very mixed legacy. So be very familiar as to how it has some pros and some cons there. Period 6 is going to be the rise of capitalism. Think about the big debate between robber barons and the captains of industry from Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie, and how this all relates to the holy grail, if you will, of the gospel of wealth. We also have the rise of unions that are going to come about thanks to Grangers, Knights of Labor, Eugene Debs, Great Strike of 1877, Haymarket Affair, Pullman Strike. So these are some early setbacks for these unions. Now, the first piece of legislation that comes out that's going to try to help unions is going to be the Sherman Antitrust Act, but that really has very few teeth to help curb monopolies here. Now, more in the cities, you have Boss Tweed and political machines getting votes in exchange for doing services for especially new immigrants who are arriving. We also have this period of 7 presidents that really don't stand out all that much. I like to refer to them as the less than magnificent 7 presidents. You also have some immigration bills being passed here, especially the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is where you're going to see rise of more immigrants. And think about the push and pull factors. What's pushing them out of their native country and what's pulling them to the United States. We also have the Populist Party that's going to emerge and be very familiar with the election of 1896 and some of its major consequences, including shifting the Republican Party from one of being free soil to now one of big business. Now, period 7 is going to start with imperialism, and we see this with various foreign policies from the Roosevelt corollary to Taft's dollar diplomacy, Wilson's moral diplomacy. Be very familiar with the differences here. Progressives are really ushered in thanks a lot to the muckrakers. We see this to an extent with the Square Deal under Teddy Roosevelt, and then, of course, with Wilson's Clayton Antitrust Act, as well as the 16th through 19th Amendments. Also keep in mind that some of progressivism is not just at the national level, it's also at the state level. And we also see a rise of conservation thanks to national parks, starting with Teddy Roosevelt. There's also a debate between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois as to what's the best method to deal with the status of African Americans at this point. Be aware of that big debate. And the United States is going to get dragged into World War I. So think about some of the major causes here and how people's individual rights are going to be dwarfed here. Following World War I, you'll note that there's a curb on immigration thanks to the Emergency Quota Acts of 21 and then 24. You also see the Sacco and Vanzetti case, and you also have issues with prohibition thanks to mobsters like Al Capone gaining a lot of traction, and you have a lot of violence and people just outright violating the law. During this time period, you're going to see Republican presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. This is almost like back to business in the Gilded Age 2.0, if you will. But in comes the Great Depression. Hoover really not doing much for the country in terms of government intervention, and in comes FDR with his New Deal. And as a president, again, we have some of the lasting legacy thanks to the New Deal, Social Security being one of them, the TVA, for example. But it's not without its critics. You have the Supreme Court that's going to block, for example, the AAA. You also have court packing, in which FDR is trying to pack the court, add more justices to get more of his legislation passed. That does not happen, and it's very controversial. Also important to note that FDR has a black cabinet. Also, Eleanor Roosevelt by his side. She is his eyes and ears very much, and he will lead us also into World War II following neutrality. So keep in mind some of these major aspects of World War II. This is not going to be covered too much in depth, in my opinion here. That's more European history, but do know total war, victory in Europe versus victory in Japan Day, the role of the atomic bomb, as well as contributions from Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and especially women on the home front. All right, now we're in period 8, and this is all about the Cold War abroad and at home. So be familiar with a lot of the policies, but the big ones here, containment and the domino theory. We also have various doctrines, for example, Truman Doctrine, we have the Marshall Plan, NATO brinksmanship. So be aware based on the president and what their specific plan is, but definitely containment is going to start from after World War II up until the end of the Cold War. We also have the Forgotten War with the Korean War, and that's going to end essentially with the stalemate and a North and South Korea. Cold War is going to also extend to Latin America, so keep in mind with Guatemala, for example, Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis under JFK. But we also have Cold War at home. HUAC, McCarthy hearings, even the Rosenbergs who were executed. You also have the institution of the Federal Loyalty Program. And then we'll then move our way into the Vietnam War, which is going to be escalated thanks to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is essentially a blank check. And then once we have the Tet Offensive, you see popularity of the war beginning to decline quite rapidly, especially when there's secret bombings of Cambodia under Nixon. So think about some of the major aspects of that war with LBJ, especially with his policy of escalation. But it's not without its thaws and détente, Nixon being a major role there, especially with China, as well as Vietnamization and SALT I and SALT II in terms of creating those thaws. In comes Reagan, who's going to sort of up the ante, and you also have Gorbachev for the USSR. It's very important that you have cool minds coming about, and that's going to be very important in terms of ultimately ending the Cold War. But Reagan takes a hardline approach, as we see in the Evil Empire speech, also a Star Wars program, if you will. Other notable important events to mention here, OPEC, the Iranian hostage crisis, and Iran-Contra, especially with Reagan. That's a biggest blemish of his presidency. Now, the Cold War at home, we have the GI Bill, very important, Levittown, conformity, Sunbelt growth in the Southwest. We also are going to have increasing amounts of defense spending, especially with a new agency known as NASA, and also into education. LBJ's defining hallmark program is going to be the Great Society, massive expansion of money and programs, and it's almost like the New Deal 2.0, if you will. We also have the anti-Vietnam protests. For example, we see a Kent State massacre. We also see the SDS, and there's a lot of distrust of government, especially as we see with the Pentagon Papers, Nixon, and the War Powers Act trying to take some power away from the president. Civil rights, of course, being a big aspect of period 8. So be aware of boycotts, Brown v. Board of Education, which is going to reverse Plessy v. Ferguson, but hallmark pieces of legislation from Civil Rights, Voting Rights Act, letter from Birmingham Jail, and various tactics here and some groups here, CORE and SNCC. And this is going to spur other movements such as gay rights, women's rights, Native Americans' rights, Hispanic Americans, so be aware of that. But for presidents such as Carter, stagflation, the oil crisis, going to be very problematic for their presidency. policies. And then following in period 9, to be familiar with the rise of conservatives here with Reagan, Reaganomics, less spending on social programs. You also have this element of religion with the moral majority. Once you get into H.W. Bush, you have the Persian Gulf War, which is relatively short compared to other past wars. You have Clinton with NAFTA, Welfare Reform Act, the dot-com bubble, and then, of course, 9/11 under George W. Bush, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then finally with Obama, the Great Recession, healthcare, and, of course, Osama bin Laden. All right.